I didn't say a word when the mayor lifted those oversized silver scissors and smiled for the cameras. I just watched. Red and white balloons snapped in the wind. A cheap brass band stumbled through a celebratory tune. A massive banner stretched across the entrance of Stonebrook Village Plaza. Letters shining in the afternoon sun like this was the greatest achievement our little town had ever seen. $4.8 million in fresh concrete, glass, and steel. 22 brand new storefronts. Every single one of them sitting on land that legally belonged to me. The crowd clapped. Phones were raised. Someone started counting down. That's when I stepped forward. "Before you cut that ribbon," I said calmly, my voice carrying farther than I expected, "you might want to check who actually owns the ground under your feet." The applause died mid-echo. You could feel the silence spread, slow and heavy. Melissa Crane, the HOA president, turned toward me, and the color drained from her face. Not confusion, not surprise, recognition. She knew exactly what she had done, and she knew I finally had the proof. 3 months earlier, she'd stood in my driveway and tried to pressure a grieving widower into signing away 12 acres he'd inherited from his grandfather. She thought loss had made me weak. She thought I would fold to threats and legal jargon. Instead, she handed me the motivation to dismantle everything she built. What she saw that afternoon wasn't a lonely man standing in her way. It was the worst mistake of her career, walking straight toward the microphone. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I have lived in Briar Hollow, Tennessee my entire life, long enough to remember when the only traffic jam in town was a tractor pulling a stubborn mule. Long enough to remember when land meant something more than resale value. My grandfather bought our 12 acres just after World War II. He paid for it with savings from factory shifts and a small veteran's loan. The deed is still framed in my hallway, dated 1947. The land is simple. A stretch of open pasture. A small pecan grove, a white farmhouse that leans a little to the left but refuses to fall. It is not impressive, it is not glamorous, but it carries 3 generations of fingerprints. I proposed to my wife Linda under those pecan trees. We raised our son there. We buried 2 dogs at the edge of the property line. So when Stonebrook Estates appeared 5 years ago on the north side of my fence, I kept to myself. Developers carved neat rows out of what used to be hay fields. Identical houses, fresh sod, decorative street lamps that looked like they belonged in a catalog. Along with it came the Stonebrook Homeowners Association, complete with bylaws thicker than most church hymnals. At first, they ignored me. I was outside their neighborhood boundaries, just the old house next door. Then Melissa Crane became HOA president. Melissa had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Former real estate agent, perfect hair, perfect posture, the kind of woman who called everyone neighbor while mentally calculating square footage. About 3 months after Linda passed away from pancreatic cancer, Melissa pulled into my driveway in a white SUV that still had the dealership sticker on it. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone would show up uninvited while casseroles were still arriving from church members. She stepped out holding a leather folder. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said gently, tilting her head just enough to look compassionate. Then she handed me paperwork. According to her, there had been a boundary clarification issue discovered during a recent development survey. The HOA had commissioned an updated property line review. Apparently, the back corner of my land, nearly 2 acres, was now being identified as association property. Specifically, the portion that would allow road access for what she called their future commercial district. She said it casually, like she was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. I read the survey summary twice. The new line shifted almost 200 feet inward from where my grandfather's fence had stood for decades. "That can't be right," I told her. She smiled again. Sometimes old rural properties weren't measured as precisely as modern standards require. I had spent 30 years working as a civil engineer for the state transportation department. I understood measurement standards very well. "I'm not signing anything," I said. Her expression hardened for half a second before she recovered. "Of course, take your time." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a friendly visit. Within 2 weeks, certified letters began arriving. The first claimed I was maintaining fencing on HOA property. The second warned of potential legal action for obstructing planned infrastructure improvements. The third accused me of hindering community economic growth. That phrase stuck with me. Hindering growth. As if my grandfather's land was some kind of weed that needed trimming. Then neighbors I had never spoken to started avoiding eye contact at the grocery store. Someone mentioned that the HOA newsletter had described me as a non-compliant adjacent landowner resisting mutually beneficial development. Mutually beneficial. I hadn't agreed to anything. I attended one HOA meeting out of curiosity. Melissa stood at the front with architectural renderings displayed on an easel. There it was, a concept drawing of a plaza, coffee shops, boutique stores, a fitness studio. And right in the middle of the design was a road cutting directly through the corner of what I knew was my pasture. She pointed to it proudly. "This access corridor will connect Stonebrook to the main highway and significantly increase property values." Someone asked if the land was secured. She smiled and said, "We are resolving minor boundary discrepancies." Minor. 2 acres is not minor when it is the only open land your family has left. After the meeting, I approached her privately. "You don't have permission to build anything on my property," I said. She lowered her voice. "Mr. Bennett, fighting this will be expensive. For everyone. It would be easier if we worked together." There it was. Not a request. A warning. I went home that night unsettled but not afraid. What I didn't know yet was how far they had already gone. A week later, I stopped by the county planning office to ask a few questions. The clerk hesitated before pulling up public filings. Stonebrook Development Group had already submitted a rezoning application for commercial use on the exact strip of land Melissa claimed was under clarification. The documents referenced parcel adjustments that had not been approved. They had included the disputed acreage in architectural submissions. They were moving forward as if ownership had already changed. Without my signature, without a court ruling, without my consent, I walked out of that office holding copies of paperwork that made my hands shake. It wasn't just an aggressive HOA president trying to push boundaries. They were positioning themselves to build first and argue later. And if they managed to pour concrete before I reacted, undoing it would become a nightmare. That's when I realized this wasn't about a fence line. It was about control. And Melissa Crane had decided my land was the easiest way to get it. Within 6 months of that first boundary clarification conversation, the rumble of engines replaced the sound of wind through my pecan trees. Bulldozers showed up at dawn, not directly on my pasture, but so close to the so-called corrected boundary line that I could stand on my porch and see operators glancing at my fence like it was an inconvenience waiting to be removed. They moved fast, unnaturally fast. Survey flags popped up overnight. Stakes were driven into soil that had been untouched for decades. Then came the concrete trucks. Steel beams followed. Crews worked from sunrise until floodlights flickered on after dark. It wasn't cautious development. It was acceleration. And that told me everything. They were trying to build momentum before I could slow them down. One afternoon, I walked the edge of the property with a copy of my grandfather's survey in my hand. According to the HOA's updated map, the new boundary shaved nearly 200 feet off my north side. According to the original recorded deed, the concrete monument marking the true corner still sat buried beneath a patch of weeds just inside my fence. I found it, old, worn, solid. The original marker hadn't moved, but their paperwork had. When the first foundation slab was poured, I attended the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Melissa stood at the front, glowing with confidence, architectural renderings displayed behind her like trophies. She talked about revitalization, economic expansion, future prosperity. When she opened the floor for comments, I stood up. "You're building against a disputed boundary," I said. "You don't have my consent." The room shifted uncomfortably. Melissa didn't flinch. She folded her hands and gave me that same polished smile. "If you believe you have a legitimate claim, Mr. Bennett, you are of course welcome to pursue legal action." The room went quiet. It sounded polite, but what she really meant was clear. "Take us to court if you think you can afford it." I had just buried my wife. Medical bills were still stacked on my kitchen counter. They assumed I was financially and emotionally exhausted. They assumed I would fold. Construction intensified the following week. Utility trenches were dug, water lines installed, electrical conduit laid beneath soil that had belonged to my family for nearly 80 years. I watched as steel frames rose into the sky, each one a silent challenge. It stopped being about access roads. It became about domination. I started digging into public records. That's when I uncovered what she hadn't expected anyone to check. Stonebrook Development Group, the company building the plaza, was not some independent contractor hired by the HOA. It was majority owned by Melissa Crane. 60%. Her name was buried in the filing documents, tucked neatly behind a limited liability structure. She wasn't just overseeing the project. She was profiting from it. And it got worse. The development had secured a state economic improvement grant. Private investors from neighboring counties had bought in, even HOA reserve funds. Money homeowners had paid for maintenance and emergencies were partially allocated toward infrastructure support. I added the numbers slowly, double-checking every line. Total exposure, $4.8 million. That wasn't a casual miscalculation. That was a high-stakes gamble, and the bet was simple that I wouldn't fight. Because if I did, and if the original boundary held up in court, every storefront, every poured slab, every installed pipe would be sitting on land they did not legally own. They weren't correcting a surveying mistake. They were rushing to create a situation too expensive to undo. Build it first. Argue later. Force a settlement. The pressure escalated after that. I received another certified letter claiming my fence obstructed emergency access, then one accusing me of creating unsafe visual barriers near the construction zone. I even found orange paint markings creeping suspiciously close to my pecan grove. They were inching forward, testing how much I would tolerate. Neighbors who once waved from across the field now avoided conversation. The HOA newsletter praised Melissa's visionary leadership and described the plaza as inevitable progress. I began to understand something critical. This wasn't just about land value. It was about control of narrative. If they framed me as the stubborn old man blocking opportunity, then any legal fight would look selfish. If they built fast enough, public opinion would shift in their favor. I drove past the construction site one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the frames of what would soon be storefront windows. The skeletal outline of the plaza cast long shadows across what used to be open pasture. And for the first time, I felt anger replace grief. Not loud anger, not reckless anger, cold anger, the kind that sharpens instead of explodes. Melissa believed she held leverage because she had money, investors, and a board that echoed her decisions without question. But she had overlooked one thing. Documentation outlives ambition. Concrete can harden in a day. Steel can rise in a week. But land records, if they are accurate, don't bend to optimism or marketing campaigns. They had already sunk millions into a structure balanced on a boundary they altered without consent. And the faster they built, the higher the fall would be. That's when I stopped reacting and started preparing. Here's what Melissa never bothered to find out about me. Before I ever became the stubborn landowner next door, I spent 30 years as a civil engineer for the Tennessee State Transportation Department. I helped design highway expansions, bridge alignments, and rural access roads. My entire career revolved around one thing: precise measurements. Inches matter when you're pouring concrete. Feet matter when you're defining ownership. And I never threw paperwork away. In a metal filing cabinet in my hallway closet, I kept every original deed, survey map, and boundary record tied to my family's 12 acres. Documents dating all the way back to 1947. My grandfather believed in records. Land fades, he used to say. Paper stays. He had even installed a permanent concrete survey monument at the northeast corner of the property decades ago. Not a wooden stake, not a temporary marker. A reinforced concrete post set deep enough that frost and time couldn't shift it. If the HOA believed a quick modern redraw could erase that, they underestimated the wrong man. Instead of confronting Melissa again, I decided to do this properly. Quietly, methodically, I hired an independent surveyor named Hannah Cole, former Army Corps of Engineers. No connection to Briar Hollow, no ties to the HOA. She came highly recommended and, more importantly, had a reputation for not being influenced by local politics. When she first walked the land with her equipment, she didn't say much. She located the original monument in less than an hour. She cross-referenced old county plats. She ran coordinates against current satellite data. 3 days later, she called me. Her voice was calm, professional. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "the adjusted survey the HOA filed is not a minor correction. It is a relocation." "How far?" I asked. 190, 7 feet at its widest point. Nearly 200 feet. That wasn't rounding error. That was deliberate. Hannah prepared a formal report with stamped certification. The language was careful but clear. The original 1947 boundary markers were valid and legally binding. The HOA's recent submission failed to reference the historic monument. The so-called correction displaced the line significantly without documented justification. Then she overlaid their development blueprint onto the verified property map. Every single one of the 22 storefront foundations fell within my original boundary, not brushing it, not barely crossing it, fully inside. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that overlay for a long time. Steel beams and plumbing trenches now stood on land my grandfather had plowed by hand. Up until that moment, I had considered the possibility that this was reckless ambition. Maybe a surveyor cut corners. Maybe Melissa relied on faulty information. Then the second turning point arrived. His name was Daniel Ruiz. He had been the HOA secretary for nearly a year before abruptly stepping down. I remembered him from one meeting, quiet, taking notes, rarely speaking. He showed up at my porch one evening just after sunset, nervous, glancing over his shoulder like someone might be watching. "I don't want trouble," he said, "but what they're doing isn't right." He explained that during his time on the board, Melissa often held private planning sessions separate from recorded meetings. She controlled the agenda. She filtered what made it into official minutes. When Daniel started asking questions about the boundary shift, he was told to trust the consultants. A week later, he was replaced. Before leaving, he made copies, email backups, internal discussions, draft proposals that never appeared in public filings. He handed me a small flash drive. "I thought you should have this," he said, "in case it ever mattered." It mattered. That night, I opened the files on my laptop. Thread after thread between Melissa and the development partners. They discussed timeline pressure, investor confidence, risk management, and then I found the message that erased any remaining doubt. From Melissa Crane to a consulting survey firm representative. "Owner probably won't notice. We just need the access secured before permitting closes." The timestamp was months before the first construction permit was approved. She knew. She knew the boundary was questionable. She knew consent had not been granted, and instead of resolving it properly, she chose speed. Build first. Force the issue later. That single sentence transformed the situation from a civil disagreement into something far more serious. It was no longer a dispute about interpretation. It was evidence of intent. Intent changes everything in property law. Intent means bad faith. Intent means exposure. I leaned back in my chair and felt something shift inside me. For months, I had been reacting, responding to letters, watching construction, trying to understand how far they would push. Now the balance tilted. They had assumed grief made me distracted. They assumed age made me slow. They assumed isolation made me powerless. Instead, they had built nearly $5 million worth of commercial property on land supported by documented history and reinforced by their own written admission. This wasn't going to be a shouting match at an HOA meeting anymore. This was going to be strategy. Because once you can prove that someone knowingly built on property they do not own, the law stops being flexible and starts being unforgiving. Once I had Hannah's certified survey and Daniel's email archive, I stopped thinking like a frustrated neighbor and started thinking like an engineer again. Engineers do not react, they calculate. The next step was legal muscle. I met Russell Shaw in a small brick office just off the courthouse square. He was in his late 60s, silver hair, suspenders, and the kind of steady voice that makes you feel like panic is optional. He had spent decades handling property disputes across rural counties. When I laid the survey maps and printed emails across his desk, he didn't interrupt. He just read, slowly, carefully. When he finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "This," he said, tapping the email that read "Owner probably won't notice," "changes the entire posture of this case." He explained something that made my pulse quicken. Under Tennessee property law, if a party knowingly builds permanent improvements on land they do not own, especially after being aware of a boundary dispute, the court can rule that the improvements were made in bad faith. And in bad faith construction cases, the rightful landowner can gain ownership of those improvements after financial reconciliation, meaning if we proved intent, the plaza itself could legally become mine, steel, concrete, storefronts, all of it. Not as revenge, as remedy. But Russell did not look excited. He looked strategic. "Timing matters," he said. "Right now they've invested a lot, but not everything. If you file today, they'll pause construction. They'll negotiate. They'll try to settle cheap." He slid the survey map back toward me. "If you wait until completion, their exposure multiplies. Investors lock in. Leases get signed. Political reputations attached to it." He looked me straight in the eye. "Let them finish. Let them celebrate. Then we file." It felt counterintuitive. Every instinct told me to stop the construction immediately. Every new wall that went up felt like an insult. But Russell was right. A half-built project is flexible. A finished one is vulnerable. So I waited, and I watched. Billboards went up along the highway advertising Stonebrook Village Plaza as Briar Hollow's future. Leasing banners hung from chain-link fences. A coffee franchise signed on. A boutique fitness studio announced Prezale memberships. social media filled with polished renderings and countdown posts. Melissa became the face of it all. She did interviews with the local paper. She talked about visionary leadership and unlocking untapped potential. She praised the HOA board for bold thinking. Not once did she mention the pending boundary dispute. Not once did she acknowledge the landowner whose signature was missing from every filing. Meanwhile, Russell quietly filed a notice of dispute with the county, preserving my claim without triggering immediate injunction. It was a procedural chess move. It ensured that no one could argue later that I had slept on my rights. Construction accelerated as winter approached. Storefront glass went in. Parking lots were striped. Landscaping crews planted decorative shrubs just feet from the original survey monument Hannah had re-verified. I drove past it almost daily, not to intimidate anyone, but to remind myself what was at stake. Each passing week increased their financial exposure. I began tracking it out of habit. Investor capital contributions, grant allocations, HOA reserve transfers listed in meeting minutes, $4.8 million, and climbing. Russell kept emphasizing one thing: optics. If this explodes quietly in a courtroom, they can spin it, he said. If it explodes publicly, narrative shifts. That's when we learned the official opening date, Valentine's Day. Melissa framed it as symbolic. A gift to the community, she said in a promotional video. The mayor confirmed attendance. Local news stations scheduled coverage. A ribbon-cutting ceremony with balloons, live music, and speeches. Public celebration. Cameras rolling. Exactly the kind of moment where confidence peaks and defenses drop. Russell outlined the plan carefully. We would finalize the lawsuit in advance. File for declaratory judgment on boundary ownership, trespass, and bad faith construction. Include the certified survey. Include the internal emails proving intent. Then we would request a temporary injunction to halt operations pending full trial. The goal was not chaos. It was leverage. If granted, that injunction would freeze the plaza's ability to operate legally. No tenants could open. No revenue could flow. Investors would panic, and all of it would hinge on the same foundation they had gambled on. A boundary shift they knew was questionable. The weeks leading up to Valentine's Day were strangely calm. Melissa appeared more confident than ever. She posted photos from inside unfinished storefronts, hard hat tilted just enough for the camera. She praised the construction crew. She thanked homeowners for their patience. She believed momentum protected her. But momentum without ownership is just speed toward a cliff. The night before the grand opening, Russell called me. The judge will review the emergency injunction first thing in the morning, he said. If granted, we move. I barely slept. Not because I doubted the documentation, but because once this happened, there would be no going back. Briar Hollow would divide. Neighbors would take sides. Melissa would fight. Yet the alternative was worse. Letting nearly $5 million of concrete permanently redefine my grandfather's land. At dawn on Valentine's Day, I dressed in a pressed shirt and pulled the original 1947 deed from its frame. I slid it into a leather folder alongside Hannah's certified survey and printed copies of Melissa's email. By noon, balloons would rise. Speeches would begin, and $4.8 million worth of misplaced confidence would meet a boundary that never moved. Russell had been right about one thing. Let them cut the ribbon, then we file. The week before the grand opening, we made our move. Quietly. No press release. No dramatic confrontation. No warning shot across the bow. Russell filed the lawsuit in county court under seal for emergency review. Trespass. Fraudulent misrepresentation. Declaratory judgment to affirm boundary ownership. And a request for temporary injunctive relief to halt commercial operation of the plaza pending full adjudication. Every exhibit was attached. The 1947 deed, the certified independent survey, the photographic evidence of the original concrete monument, and Daniel's archived emails, including the one sentence that changed everything. Owner probably won't notice. We didn't serve the injunction immediately. That was Russell's strategy. If word leaked too early, Melissa could delay the ribbon cutting, stall leases, or try to negotiate quietly. The leverage came from surprise, from timing. Let them commit publicly. Russell told me, let the cameras roll. Once the town sees how confident she is, the contrast will be sharper. In the meantime, Melissa was everywhere. Yard signs popped up across Stonebrook Estates, Demlo to UOUR. The local paper ran a feature calling the Plaza the most ambitious development in Briar Hollow history. She stood in front of the nearly finished fountain at the entrance and gave interviews about visionary planning. She spoke about opportunity, about rising property values, about modernizing a sleepy town, and then she made it personal. On her social media page, she posted a photo of the completed storefronts glowing at sunset. The caption read, "Progress requires courage. Some people need to stop living in the past and embrace growth." She never mentioned my name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. Neighbors who once waved now looked at me with curiosity, like I was the lone holdout against something inevitable. I overheard whispers at the hardware store. Why won't he just compromise? It's just a little strip of land. Just a little strip. 2 acres that held 80 years of history. 2 acres that anchored the entire north boundary of my family's property. The night before the grand opening, the plaza looked finished. Storefront windows were polished. Decorative lights traced the roof lines. Fresh asphalt still smelled sharp under the cool February air. A temporary stage had been set up near the entrance for speeches. From my porch, I could see the glow. I tried to distract myself by reviewing the case file one more time. Russell had warned me not to obsess, but engineers double-check. It's instinct. The survey was airtight. Hannah's credentials were unimpeachable. The original monument coordinates aligned precisely with historical county records. There was no ambiguity in the displacement, but injunctions are not automatic. Judges weigh impact, economic harm, public disruption. If the judge denied our temporary order, the plaza would open as scheduled. Businesses would operate. Revenue would begin flowing. Investors would gain traction. And fighting it afterward would become exponentially harder and more expensive. Legal battles can drain savings quickly. I had enough to sustain a fight, but not recklessly. If the court ruled against me early, I would be stepping into a prolonged war of attrition against a development backed by investors and political goodwill. Everything hinged on documentation, and those emails. Intent is what transforms a boundary dispute into bad faith construction. Without intent, the defense could argue mistake, miscommunication, survey error. With intent, it becomes calculated overreach. At 10:30 that night, my phone buzzed. A message from Russell. Judge reviewing first thing in the morning. Be ready. That was it. No reassurance, no predictions. I stepped outside onto the porch. The February air was sharp. In the distance, the plaza lights flickered softly against the dark sky. It looked permanent, solid, untouchable. But I knew what lay beneath it. Concrete poured on land defined by a boundary they shifted without consent. Steel anchored into soil mapped in 1947. Paper trails that did not align with public statements. Melissa believed momentum was protection. That by the time anyone challenged her, the town would be too invested emotionally to question her. She underestimated something fundamental. The law does not care about excitement. It cares about record. Around midnight, I walked to the edge of my pasture with a flashlight and stood over the original survey monument. I brushed dirt away from its surface and ran my hand across the cold concrete. Still there, still steady, still exactly where my grandfather had placed it decades ago. Lines on paper can be redrawn, maps can be resubmitted, but physical markers and recorded deeds carry weight courts respect. I went back inside and laid the leather folder on the kitchen table. Inside it were the original deed, the certified survey, and printed copies of the email threads. If the judge granted the temporary injunction, tomorrow would not be a celebration. It would be an interruption. If the judge denied it, tomorrow would mark the beginning of a much longer and more uncertain battle. Either way, there was no turning back. At 5 in the morning, I was already awake when my phone rang. Russell's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I just stared at it, knowing that whatever he said next would determine whether $4.8 million of confidence remained standing uncontested, or whether it would freeze in place before the first ribbon was ever cut. The ribbon hovered in the air, waiting for the ceremonial snip that was supposed to mark a new beginning. Cameras clicked, journalists leaned forward, and the mayor's voice rang out, praising the HOA for visionary leadership. Applause trickled through the crowd, polite but hollow, unaware of the storm about to break. Melissa stepped forward, perfectly poised, rehearsed smile in place. But before her hand could reach the scissors, I stepped into the frame. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Russell moved with calm authority, handing the sheriff deputy the court order. The words were cold and precise: temporary injunction, granted that very morning. The construction, hailed as progress just moments before, was now declared unlawful encroachment, frozen in legal limbo, pending the full trial. Every eye turned to him as he spoke, voice carrying across the square, clear and unshakable. Under state law, improvements made in bad faith may transfer to the rightful landowner. He held aloft the original deed from 1947, its edges yellowed but irrefutable. Next came the copies of Melissa's emails, lined up like a dam about to break. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a wave of disbelief and shock. Melissa's carefully practiced composure faltered. She tried to argue, to spin it into a misunderstanding, but every word was drowned out by the weight of proof. Daniel's archived backups, meticulously preserved, left no room for doubt. Every attempt at denial collapsed under the clarity of evidence. The deputy, face stern but professional, addressed her directly. She would need to step aside immediately, pending investigation for fraud and misappropriation of HOA funds. The cameras caught every moment, every flash, capturing the unraveling of a scheme years in the making. The ribbon sagged untouched. Storefronts behind it remained shuttered. The ribbon-cutting ceremony, meant to symbolize achievement and progress, had instead become a tableau of halted ambition and frozen assets. $4.8 million in construction costs, contracts, and investments were now trapped in a legal stalemate, immobile until justice could untangle the web of deceit. Whispers of outrage and disbelief swirled through the onlookers. Some muttered about the HOA's arrogance, others about the audacity of someone attempting to seize what was not theirs. Yet in that moment, the crowd realized that power and authority, no matter how polished or well-funded, could be challenged with truth and evidence. Russell remained calm, a steady pillar amid the chaos, while I felt the tension finally shift. The narrative had flipped. Melissa's plans, so meticulously laid out over years, unraveled in a single morning. What had been presented as progress, a celebration of development and expansion, now exposed as fraud. Ambition built on shaky foundations. The press had a field day, capturing Melissa's shocked expressions, the frozen ribbon, and the empty storefronts behind her. Social media would light up by nightfall, turning the spectacle into a viral story of corporate overreach, HOA power, and the triumph of rightful ownership. No cheers erupted, only murmurs of astonishment. No ribbon cut, no grand opening. No smiling photographs for the mayor's office. Instead, there was a stark, undeniable truth, displayed for all to see. Accountability could not be avoided, and shortcuts taken in bad faith carried consequences. And as we watched Melissa escorted away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others quietly whispering about the twists of fate. $4.8 million remained in legal suspension, a stark reminder that wealth and influence could falter when confronted with justice. It was a victory that felt surreal, almost cinematic. The courthouse steps and the unfinished construction behind it painted a dramatic tableau: ambition halted, deception exposed, and rightful ownership defended. The story would linger, a cautionary tale about power, greed, and the importance of transparency. By the end of the day, the square emptied, leaving behind only the frozen ribbon and the silent, incomplete buildings. A moment of reckoning had passed, and in its wake, the clarity of truth shone brighter than any ribbon-cutting ceremony ever could. 6 months later, the dust settled, but not without leaving deep marks on everyone involved. The civil case had moved slowly, deliberately, each hearing exposing layers of deception, mismanagement, and ambition gone awry. Melissa had thought time and influence could shield her, but the truth, meticulously documented, refused to be buried. Investors, outraged by her reckless decisions, filed suit against her personally. Their anger was palpable, each deposition a confrontation, each testimony peeling back another layer of her carefully constructed defenses. The HOA board, once complicit in her schemes, finally moved decisively. She was removed, stripped of authority, her ambitions dismantled as thoroughly as the lies she'd built to protect them. The development company that had carried her vision and her schemes was dissolved. Its name vanished from records, a cautionary footnote in the town's history. The court's final ruling was clear and unambiguous. Every structure erected in bad faith on my land legally belonged to me. The decision came with provisions for financial restitution, balancing fairness for the investors while affirming ownership rights. It was a moment of justice that felt both satisfying and surreal. All the blueprints, permits, and grandiose plans that Melissa had wielded like weapons had been rendered powerless. I chose a different path with the tenants. Each had signed leases in good faith, unaware of the battles that had unfolded over the ground beneath their feet. Evicting them would have been an injustice, compounding the wrongs of the past with new suffering. Instead, I saw an opportunity to reshape what had been intended as a tool of greed into a foundation for community growth. Thus, the Linda Bennett Community Market was born. The Plaza, once a symbol of manipulation, became a space designed to empower. Local vendors were prioritized, given access to affordable leases that encouraged entrepreneurship rather than exploitation. Each stall, each shop, carried a story of someone building a life with dedication and care, and for the first time, the space felt alive with purpose rather than tension. I implemented reduced lease rates deliberately, ensuring that small-scale vendors, often overlooked by larger commercial developers, could thrive. The goal wasn't just profit, it was sustainability and inclusivity. A portion of the market's profits was earmarked to fund scholarships for first-generation college students. Young people who might never have imagined higher education now had a tangible path forward, supported by a space that had once been a battlefield. The transformation was astonishing. The plaza that Melissa had tried to weaponize for personal gain became a beacon for the town. Families gathered on weekends, local artists showcased their work, and students found mentors among the vendors who had built businesses from scratch. The community, once passive observers of HOA power struggles, now had a stake in the space, a place to contribute and grow. Melissa's name faded from conversations quickly, replaced by stories of the market and its impact. The scandal lingered, of course, proof that ambition unchecked could lead to ruin, but it was eclipsed by the tangible benefits of turning a negative into a positive. The structures she had poured resources into, designed to intimidate and profit at others' expense, now housed entrepreneurship, opportunity, and connection. What had been meant as a display of dominance and control was, through careful stewardship, transformed into something genuinely beneficial. The irony was not lost on anyone who had witnessed the original ribbon-cutting debacle. $4.8 million once trapped in legal limbo became the seed for community investment. Each lease, each scholarship, each market stall was a reminder that the best outcomes often emerge from the ashes of conflict. Walking through the plaza on opening day, I could see the difference. Children ran past colorful vendor stalls, the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee drifting through the air. Local musicians played on a small stage, while families lingered, enjoying the energy and connection of a place designed to give back. There was no tension, no fear, only the steady hum of a community flourishing. In retrospect, the entire ordeal had been transformative, not just for the town, but for me as well. It was a lesson in resilience, patience, and the power of turning confrontation into creation. Melissa's actions had forced a reckoning, but they had also opened a door to something far greater than what she could have imagined. The plaza stood as proof that good intentions, coupled with accountability and foresight, could overcome greed. A community market, built from contested land and adversity, had become a lasting legacy, demonstrating that even in the wake of manipulation and betrayal, positive change was possible, and sometimes it was more powerful than anyone's original vision. The same plaza that had been weaponized against the town now offered opportunity, growth, and hope. And for once, everyone who stepped onto that ground could feel it ownership, not just of property, but of the chance to make something meaningful, together. Sometimes people think power comes from titles, from being HOA president, from controlling meetings, from sending threatening letters. But real power, it's in the paperwork, in patience, in standing your ground when you know you're right. Melissa thought grief had made me weak. What she never understood is that when you've already lost the love of your life, fear doesn't hold much sway. Now, I sit on my porch and watch families wander through the plaza we reclaimed. I don't feel revenge. I feel balance. She built it for profit. I kept it for purpose. And here's the lesson I want you to take away. Never assume someone won't fight back just because they seem quiet. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. It means patience. It means strategy. It means resolve. The same space she tried to weaponize now breathes life into our town. Vendors flourish. Students get scholarships. Families have a place to gather. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's deliberate, steady, and lasting. If you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Every story, every voice, every town matters. Sometimes the quietest fights leave the biggest impact.